Hello, Rebels. Welcome back to the base. You've got me, Kristen Garcia-Dumont, and Steve Hilton.
Here I am.
All right, well, we've got a great show today, so don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. And let's get right to it with our extraordinary guest, whose bio I'm very excited to read because it's got a great ending, so wait for it. So we've got Carol Roth today. She's a content creator, a recovering investment banker, which is my favorite phrase, author of The War on Small Business. She's an entrepreneur, an investor, a TV pundit and host, and the New York Times bestselling author of The Entrepreneur Equation. She works in a variety of industries and is a director on public and private company boards as a strategic advisor. She advocates for small business, which is going to be a major focus of our show today, and advocates for big hair, which we love. And Steve decided that he's an ally of those who are fans of big hair.
Yeah, I don't think I can actually sort of, great to see you, Carol. I think the big hair, that's just not going to happen for me. But I can definitely be an ally of yours in that fight, that very important fight. And by the way, we should just say, what could someone who's written a book called The War on Small Business possibly have to do with California? I wonder. We'll definitely get to that today. Tell us, Carol, how you let's start there actually, because it's such a great, it's just a simple and great and powerful phrase, which I just think everyone listening in California and beyond, but certainly in California, we're obviously focused on California here, who runs a small business or knows someone who runs a small business, that's what they're experiencing, a war waged on them by the policymakers who've been in power for so long here. Tell us how you got to that as the kind of focus of that particular aspect of what you've been working on.
Yes, I've been a small business advocate for a long time, but I also cover the markets and the economy and business and all finance, all the things that are related, more generally speaking. And so when these crazy mandates came down from the government back in March of 2020, and it was clear that it wasn't going to be 15 days to slow the spread, HarperCollins approached me and they said, we'd like somebody with some actual economic chops to follow along because we know this is going to be a historic economic moment, and kind of follow us and tell us what happened in a realistic way. And like a complete moron, I was like, oh, that sounds like a fun idea, not realizing how hard it was going to be to keep up with the changing narrative and really find out what was going on in real time. So over the course of almost a year, I wrote like 3.5 different books, I think it was. But as it all shook out, it was very clear from the beginning and then kind of tailing through the end that small business was a huge part of that, and just this battle between decentralization and centralized power. What we saw happen last year was just extraordinary. We saw the government deciding who is going to thrive and who is going to fight to survive, labeling certain people and businesses essential and certain ones non-essential. And they did that not based on data or science, but based on political clout and connections. And as you can imagine, the small businesses don't typically have the political clout and connections like the middle class and average Americans. And that enabled the biggest transfer of wealth that we have ever seen in history from the middle class, from Main Street to Wall Street. And so that was an important part of what I wanted to capture. And certainly small business, which is the backbone of our economy, plays a huge role in
You've just hit on so many things I'm completely obsessed with there. Just in a very, very, the biggest possible picture, as it were, to step back from it. That kind of central idea that you mentioned there, centralized versus decentralized power. That's at the heart of so much, not just in the economy and in business, but it's just really, the big thing that's going wrong, I think, that too much power is being centralized. On the economic front and that transfer of wealth, of course, that's exactly right. And I think that, and I'd love to dive into that. Kristen, you just weigh in on that in a second as well. I just think that the thing I'd add to it is that, Main Street to Wall Street. And on top of that, the thing that I was thinking as you were talking was the way that certain big corporations, particularly in the tech, Amazon is the one that comes to mind. Let's just not beat around the bush. Amazon comes to mind when you think about that transfer from small decentralized parts of the economy to a centralized version. I just remember during the pandemic when the media were kind of touting this announcement. I think either it was an announcement or it was a kind of someone had added up the job. Anyway, there was something in the news. I remember the number very clearly. Amazon hires 450,000 extra people. And it was like, isn't this great?
Right.
Amazon, Jeff Bezos hiring 450,000. And you say, yeah, why is he hiring 450,000 extra people? Of course, you're happy that someone gets a job. But the reason is that all the small businesses are being shut down. And they can't open. And, your local store is shut, but Target's open or whatever. And that's where that number's coming from. And, of course, you're happy for the individual people, but you're not happy for the fact that so much wealth and power has been transferred, exactly as you said, from the small local level to these giant remote corporations. Kristen, what was your reaction to what Carol was just talking about? No, I agree.
And actually, I have a question for Carol, which is your philosophy, and I tend to agree, is that was intentional. Right. Maybe it didn't start out as intentional to do this big transfer, but as I understand, one of your main points is that this was an intentional transfer of wealth. And why I think people have a hard time with that. People want to think that this was all for health and nobody had nefarious intent. This really was to try to save lives. Why do you think people have such a hard time accepting that this actually might be part of a bigger plan around power and profit?
Yeah, so I use it as sort of a choose your own adventure book. I lay out the case and I let you decide if you think the intentions were nefarious, if you think that they were incompetent, if you think that small business was maybe just inconvenient and used as cannon fodder. But I think the most important part, which often gets missed when we kind of debate these things like, what's the intention, is that the outcome ends up the same. Regardless of what the intention is. And this is the case with big government, whether you think that there are people who are evil, whether you think they're incompetent, somewhere in between.
Usually both.
And there's probably a mix, right? Yeah, there's probably a mix. It really doesn't matter. And it's just what's so infuriating is that there are so few people that really understand the economic underpinning that they can't jump to the conclusion that maybe this was intentional. So as Steve had mentioned, we have this obvious, direct transfer of wealth when you have a small business that shuts down. And so people can't spend their dollars there, or they've been so petrified by the government that they're staying at home and they're only shopping through Amazon or whatnot. And so we're seeing that revenue transfer. And we saw Amazon in the fourth quarter of 2020 have their first $100 billion revenue quarter. But there's a second piece to this, which again seems a little wonky, but is really important to understand. And that's the Federal Reserve's role in this as well. So in addition to this direct mandate, the fiscal policy and the overall government policy, you have the monetary policy, and you have this Federal Reserve that was pumping trillions of dollars into the market, and that was inflating the asset prices of these companies and giving them continued cheap access to capital so that they had access to debt we're seeing now with inflation, the real rate of what they were paying was actually negative. And they could use that money then to go out and compete with the smaller companies. So when we look at 2020, $3.4 trillion in incremental value went to 7 technology companies, as Steve was sort of alluding to. And it was a record year for IPOs, and it was a record year for capital raised via SPACs. This sort of unusual vehicle that doesn't happen unless there's a really kind of hot and frothy market. And so I think, Kristen, to your point, I just think people don't have any understanding. Like they've heard of the Federal Reserve maybe in the media, but they don't really understand the role.
Yeah.
They don't understand how they're related. And that's why people can't make that jump to, oh, maybe this is an inside job.
Can I just ask you
I think that's exactly right.
I'd love you to go in more detail on that. More wonky, please, because it's so important. And I really want to make sure we understand it because it is It is. It's such a big part of it. I know. I kind of know it intellectually, as it were, but I don't think I really understand it enough. And, you hear these phrases and you read, quantitative easing and all the rest of it, right? You hear all this stuff. So just to describe the process of how the Federal Reserve's policymaking put money in the bank accounts, to use kind of simple language, of, the big companies, but not into small companies. That's the part I would love to really understand.
Yeah, and I've devoted a whole chapter to this because I do think it's so important for people to understand this. So basically, the Federal Reserve, while they pretend they are independent, they get their mandate from Congress, because what they're supposed to be doing is, quote unquote, stabilizing prices, which means not generating inflation. We can all see what a great job they've been doing about that. And also generating full employment in the economy, which again, we can all see what a great job they've been doing on that. And to think that you're outsourcing, the functionality to that to like a third party in government is sort of absurd. They get this power and this mandate from Congress, and if they ever earn a profit, it goes back to the Treasury. So wink, wink, nudge, nudge. They are super independent. We all agree about that, right? We've all gotten the message. Mm-hmm. So basically what happens is they have the ability to go and on their balance sheet, just with a keystroke, they're not even going to the Treasury and having dollars printed, just with a keystroke, they add money to their account and they can go in the market and make purchases where they often purchase things like U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which is what they're doing now. Now, if you or I went into our account, put in fake dollars and went to buy things in the market, we would call that fraud. When the Fed
go to jail.
We call it monetary policy. And this is, again, supposed to achieve these objectives and stabilize the market and add liquidity and all of these, opaque terms. And through this and other things and other tools that they have at their disposal, they are holding down interest rates. They're suppressing interest rates. And I'm not going to get into the wonky details, but basically, their target rate for banks to lend to each other overnight is just about zero. It's 0 to 0.25% or 25 basis points. And again, the whole idea is that they want banks to not be holding on to money. They want them to lend. So when they go and they put these trillions of dollars on their balance sheets, they're going out to other banks and investors in the market. They're buying up the assets in the market and putting it on their balance sheet. And then that money is going to these banks and investors who are going out and lending it and buying other securities and whatnot. So it either cycles through in terms of increased access to debt that they can go out and make investments with and growth, or in some cases, purchasing other assets. And so it's basically injecting liquidity into the capital markets. And because there's so much money that's going into the capital markets, at the same time that it's holding down interest rates, it's really disrupting risk. So if you are somebody who's a saver, if you are a retiree who has money in your bank account and you're trying to earn a return on that, where you may have, 15 years ago gotten a couple percentage points on that money, now your bank says, sorry, interest rates are super low. We'll give you like nothing. And so if you want to keep up with the pace of inflation, you're going to go out and look for riskier investments, which again is probably something like the stock market. So you have more money that is being fueled there, and the prices that everybody's paying then ends up going higher. We call that the multiple on the valuation ends up going higher. So, all of this means at the end of the day that if you are the saver or the retiree, you're not getting a lot of benefit there. But if you are the big company who's taking out down a bunch of debt and buying back your stock and going out and making acquisitions, that you're getting the benefit of capital, cheap capital, at the expense of Main Street America. And certainly, again, if you're a mom and pop small business who doesn't have the capacity to take on additional debt, you're not going to be able to have that same level of competition.
Right.
So that's sort of a Sesame Street way to explain how
I think I've got an even more Sesame Street way. As you were talking, I want to make sure I've understood it properly. By the way, I'm speaking as someone who I always used to joke with my friends when I'd sort of get all this stuff wrong, because I don't have a brain for it. But I actually studied, the degree I did, I was at Oxford University, and I did a course called Philosophy, Politics and Economics. And the way you finish, in the final 2 years, you have to do like 8 papers, it's called, for your finals. And you have to mix up between the 3, philosophy, politics, and economics. And you can specialize in those degree of specialization, you can do is 5 to 3. You can, anyway, I ended up doing 5 economics papers, in which I've totally forgotten all of it. But I run around as a result of that, calling myself an economist, much to everyone's great sort of amazement, because of course I know nothing about it at all. But I just want to see if I've understood you correctly. So basically, just very simply, it's a supply and demand thing. What they've done with these by putting things on their balance sheet, the Fed and etc., they've increased the supply of money. Basically, that's what they've done. They've created more money, increased the supply, and that means, as with anything else, the price of it goes down because there's more of it around. So that's the sort of basic point, isn't it? So it's cheaper.
So that's one piece of it, and then the other piece is the disruption of risk.
Yes, so that pushes people into the stock market and more risky things, which benefits the people, the businesses who are in that world, which is big businesses.
Right.
Got it. That's really how I actually hadn't understood that. And then the final bit, I think that's really important to understand, that you've made clear to me, is the, all these financial instruments and mechanisms. I really don't want to get into that, but I know the kind of financial trickery, as some people would see it, that goes on. All of that world is a world that these big corporations have access to, but a small local business, that's all they've got is a kind of bank account with Wells Fargo down the street or whatever, and that's all they've got. Is that right?
Yeah. That's very well said, and I think it's a really important point to reiterate too, that as all of this stimulus was put out both from the Fed into the market side, as well as the government direct to individuals, individuals may have gotten $1,400 and they're sitting and they're counting their hundreds, while trillions of dollars was being driven in a Brinks truck behind them to be dumped to the stock market. Right. And that's what they're not seeing. But all of this holistically, as we're in this period of, increasing inflation after we have been lied to over and over again, inflation's not going to be a problem. Oh, it may run a little hot. Oh, it's going to be transitory or temporary. Now you've got some outlets trying to sell that, oh, it's great for you. Yeah, fantastic. Everybody likes when their dollars can buy fewer goods and services. That's a combination of these policies. It's a combination of the Fed devaluing the dollar, as you correctly identified, through printing more and putting more money supply into the market. It is a part of the stimulus that was done, same kind of thing, the government putting more money out there. And then the ridiculous decision that they made to try to turn off like a third of the economy and flip it back on like you were power cycling a modem, and not thinking that that was going to have dislocation in terms of the labor market and the supply chain, which in the supply and demand, what you were talking about, if we had more supply of dollars, and maybe that increases the demand for products and services, but we had the same amount of products and services, then there isn't as much of an imbalance as we have today, where you have that increase in demand of dollars, but then you have a decrease in the supply of services because of the disruptions in the supply chain and the labor market. So it is the worst of all outcomes. And all of this was done by government mandate. The same people who didn't see this coming, who now tell you they are going to fix it.
Yep. Can I add one point on the interest rates thing? Because I hear it all the time. And people really think it's so fantastic when interest rates are low. And there's obviously lots of reasons why that's great. But I think one of the things that became so pronounced in the lockdowns was who's benefiting from those low interest rates. If you're a small business whose receipts are now, a fraction of what they were before because you weren't deemed essential, none of those companies, like think of how many, the huge swath, the thing that fuels America, which is small business, essentially could not take advantage of that cheap debt because they were so decimated on their top line, which was their revenue. So while banks were being very, very strict with them and saying, sorry, we're not going to lend to you. You guys are risky. Your revenues are down, right? No one's shopping in your store. No one's coming into your restaurant. They didn't benefit from it. But a BlackRock, right, or somebody like that who's saying, I want to go up and buy up huge swaths of the United States, and now I can because interest rates are so low. I think that's your point, Carol, too, on that's so important to recognize about it got de-risked for the most powerful people, and nothing benefited the middle class and the lower class. People couldn't buy homes. They couldn't get debt for their businesses because they were hurt by these lockdown policies. So that combination was treacherous.
Yeah. And I'll add one more thing onto that, the duration of this, because we have been in the suppressed interest rate environment since the Great Recession. We've never gotten to a point where we have normalized either the Fed's balance sheet or interest rates in any meaningful way for any sort of duration of time. So if you were an individual who was looking to take advantage of cheap debt to, get a mortgage or refinance or whatnot, like you've done that already. You've had that opportunity. That's been going on for a really long time. So, the duration of this, those people, like you said, are tapped out, or because they have personal debt as a small business owner going into COVID, didn't have the capacity to take on additional debt, or they were shut down or whatever it is. So, the duration adds in, and all of these things just created an absolute catastrophe. And the other thing I would add too is just the differential here, as I brought up the Great Recession, between too big to fail and you can pick too small to matter or too hard to control. Again, choose your own adventure. But go back to the Great Recession financial crisis. This was something that was caused by banks and other financial institutions taking on too much risk. We were told they were too big to fail. The taxpayers had to come up with money to bail them out. And then the quote unquote slap on the wrist that they got was regulation that actually ended up hurting small business lending, which we could talk about separately if you want. But at the same time here, you have these small businesses that were closed not because they took on too much risk, not because of anything they did, but because the government decided they were non-essential and too small to matter, too hard to control. And so when people say, oh, well, they got some PPP loans or they got some money, well, that didn't even come close to compensating them for the subjugation of their property rights. I mean, under eminent domain in the Constitution, if the government takes your property for the quote unquote good of society, they need to compensate you. And so this idea that somehow the small businesses got all this money and were made whole for what was done to them is absolutely not true. Just like the fact that we were all in this together, or that there were full lockdowns, because I'll tell you, if Walmart and Amazon's warehouse had been locked down the way the small businesses were, this thing wouldn't have lasted for 2 weeks.
Exactly. Oh,
that's exactly right. And it wouldn't have lasted as long if people weren't making so much money too. I mean, people were making extraordinary amounts of money in the stock market. So it wasn't so bad. Yeah. Right. The laptop class was doing just fine and is continuing to do so.
So this is absolutely, it's getting me infuriated all over again about what happened. And I think that the really interesting, I'm so pleased that we could talk about this today, Carol, because you're completely right. I hadn't seen that kind of financial side of it so clearly, because it's literally harder to see. It's in the background, whereas you can literally see your local store closed and and Target open or whatever, so that the kind of the visible part of it was there, but this invisible part, the financial engineering, absolutely fascinating. Can I ask you to follow up on that eminent domain part? That was really interesting. I hadn't really heard that. I mean, by the way, the PPP stuff, I mean, that was a nightmare. I mean, people who went through that, the whole process was completely, so bureaucratic and whatever. I remember sort of railing against that when it was happening on my Fox show, saying, can someone fix this, please? It's just so ridiculous. They didn't, I think, to be fair to them, there was some way, because the Trump people who they had more of a contact with the business world than others, it's better than you might have expected. And at least they got local banks to do it rather than some sort of government agency. Do you know what I mean? There were things about it that were, not, absolutely catastrophic. But the whole process and the idea that, it was on the businesses to apply and just talk about that for a bit. And I've never heard that eminent domain point before in this context in the Constitution. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so this, I'll start with the eminent domain piece. There were a number of people who brought this up immediately, Scott Lincecum from Cato Institute and some others. And there were just a handful of us that were really honed in on this very early on, that, I'm a very big believer in capitalism. Mm-hmm. What I think of capitalism is freedom, choice, transparency, protected by the guardrail of property rights. Mm-hmm. To me, that is the simplistic definition. And the property rights piece is critical. It's what separates real capitalism from, what's going on in China and why they're, a bad partner. So if you believe in property rights and you believe in the Constitution, the government can't just come in and take your property. And by shutting you down, in effect, they have taken your property and they're using it with the concept that this is for the public good. This is a public good thing that we are doing. And if you believe that was the appropriate course of action, I'm okay with that if you decide you want to compensate them. Now, again, I would prefer to not have done that, but at least this would have been a constitutional effort to say we're going to shut you down and we're going to compensate you and make you whole to do this for the public good. That's what eminent domain says. And there are actually a number of lawsuits going on right now, and I've been encouraging them for the last 19 months or so, because it is unconstitutional what many of these jurisdictions did.
The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. There we are. This is a tacit recognition of a pre-existing power to take private property for public use rather than a grant of new power. Eminent domain. Yeah, there we are. Okay, so that's great.
Interesting.
I didn't know that.
There's a lot of case law that I have cited in the book that talks about the need for the appropriate compensation and what that case law is. And again, I want to get it specifically right, so I always like to go back to what I've sourced, not what I remember in my brain.
Absolutely.
So I guess kicked in.
And I just wanted to again just be really clear what we're saying here. So that means, does it, that the real if we'd been doing this, if it had been done in a fair way, in line with the Constitution and the spirit of and the letter of the Constitution, it wouldn't be just a loan that the business had to go through some bureaucratic process for or whatever and get like some of it. It would be like a fair market value for the lost business. Is that what we're talking about?
Correct. Absolutely. And I wrote a piece, I believe it was, I don't know if it was Fox News or foxbusiness.com, because I write columns for both of them. But I wrote a piece in March of 2020, as soon as I saw this come down the pike. And I actually ran the numbers. And for them to have kept these small businesses in business, paid to keep people on their workforce. So basically saying, okay, I'm sorry you can't come in, but we're going to give you your normal compensation. We're going to pay you as a worker. You're going to still pay into taxes. And this was, going to be covered. And following that concept of eminent domain, it probably would have taken about $1 trillion to maybe $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion on the upside to buy yourself 2 to 3 months to figure out a mitigation strategy. And we would not have had the same issues that we had today. It would have been, a fraction of the trillions that were spent. I think, by the end of last year, it was something like 6.6 trillion. So it would have been a fraction of the overall spend. It would have been appropriate from a constitutional standpoint. It would have protected people's jobs and made them feel like, okay, I'm still in the workforce. And it would have had a completely different tenor, and wouldn't have enabled then the crazy policies that kind of kept piling up once there was an acceptance that, oh, okay, people are going to actually go along with this. Well, like, what else can we get away with? It would have really changed the game for everybody.
Because you couldn't have done these stupid lockdowns and indefinitely. I mean, let's not get into the kind of, public health side. We've had lots of conversations on. It sounds to me like we agree about that. But you couldn't have done that realistically, because if you were in a world where you had to compensate fairly, it would just be inconceivable, because you just couldn't keep it going for that long. You couldn't have had Gavin Newsom, for example, here, bringing up the one thing I'm sort of in a way, the most crazy one was do you remember, Kristen, the outdoor, the new one after the
Pineapple Hill Saloon
exactly
and Grill.
that time,
yes.
the last Christmas, last New Year, it was after Thanksgiving, wasn't it? The second, I can't remember, second, whatever, the outdoor dining ban. When in California, when all these people that was so disgusting, and unjustified, and actually, I mean, now I am going to do a public health thing, and it actually contributed to making that wave, whatever, the second, third, whatever it was, worse, because of course it forced everyone indoors instead of
dumb.
So that's really interesting, that eminent domain. Sorry.
Can I ask a question, Carol? Because the first thing I think when you say eminent domain and this whole lockdown situation, I would have assumed, knowing nothing about this, that a temporary taking wouldn't be something that would qualify as a taking under the Fifth Amendment. And is that how
what's temporary? I mean,
maybe that is the legal question.
I mean, we're like 600 and something days into 15 days to slow the spread. So like, here's the thing. If this really was 2 weeks, and we saw this, and I talk about it in the book, the Shelley Luther case, Salon a la mode in Texas, where someone in Texas got thrown in jail for opening their business. I mean, this is how crazy it is. This happened in Texas. She came out and said, like, I was good, pitching in for 2 weeks. Yeah, it was painful, but I did it. But like 2 weeks became 3, and then it became 4, and then it became almost 5. And then it's like, this is not tenable anymore. I mean, small businesses don't make that much money. Profit for like a restaurant on average is like 3 to 6% profit. So it's not like they can just go indefinitely pitching in. I think if it was a couple days or a couple weeks, maybe you have a case. But like when you're starting to get into a month, multiple months, I mean, that's absolutely insane. And I don't see how anyone says that's temporary. But again, they keep calling inflation transitory or temporary as well. And obviously that's going on for a long time. So words no longer have any meaning in our world. So it's hard to say. But it really is incredible. I remember my husband and I had this discussion in February of 2020. We both traveled a lot. I actually got COVID in February of 2020. Didn't realize that's what it was because, we weren't getting the testing, but then got the antibody test afterwards and found out that's what it was. And when it was starting to come here, we had this like, okay, so if it does show up on the US, what do you do? Could you shut everyone down for 2 weeks? And we're both like, no, people aren't going to comply with that. But what they did that was so clever and nefarious at the same time was they just shut down the vulnerable. They shut down the people who didn't have the political clout and connections. So, in effect, the people who, would have saved us from having these longer lockdowns were actually benefiting from the fact that their competition was being shut down. So, of course, they're not going to go ahead and speak up.
Let's talk about that for a bit. And it's something you mentioned right at the beginning, this definition of essential and non-essential and how that all played out and how the people with connections managed to influence that. Just get us into that whole part of the conversation.
Yeah, so it was very easy to see when you had a big box pet retailer that was open and they could groom your pet's hair and nails, but a person's salon could not groom your hair and nails. When you had a weed dispensary that in many places had been illegal in the years prior to, this COVID situation, now being deemed essential, but a neighborhood business, whether it be a restaurant or a gym or a hair salon or whatnot that had been in your community for 20 years, deemed non-essential by government mandate. I mean, this for somebody who believes in individual rights and free enterprise, I mean, this is just, starkly the thing that you're most concerned and horrified by. And to think that this would happen in the land of opportunity and, the land of the American dream, America, was really, it's almost shocking. Like, I almost feel like there was a moment of shock where, like, could this really be happening? And then it just, once it happened, it just kind of, kept going downhill. And like you had mentioned, Steve, as it went on, some of the non-science based decisions were so egregious. In New York State, my favorite one was that bars could open up to a point of a curfew, of course, because, COVID doesn't strike you, I guess, after, 11 p.m. or whatever it is, but you had to serve food.
Right.
And then you'd have these bars that would go and they'd put out some chips. And then the inspectors would come around and say, no, I'm sorry, that's not enough food. You would have to have dip with the chips. So dip, apparently, just so you know, it's not ivermectin, but apparently, having some nacho cheese might prevent the COVID, according to the state of New York. I mean, it was just, it's so absurd, and we want to laugh at it because, like, there's no other outlet for our anger.
Right, exactly.
But thinking about this, the hundreds of thousands of small businesses that were murdered because of this, this is unconscionable. And because the market is doing well and these big companies are doing well, and that's all the media likes to focus on, that narrative gets lost. The story of all of these people and their economic freedom gets lost. And so it's why, I'm thrilled that you've given me a platform to have this discussion, because it is the most underreported story of the last 19 months.
Right. And how they enforced it was pretty scary too. So I remember reading that order from the governor saying what was essential or not. And this is when I was running a mobile game company. And unbeknownst to me at the time, because I hadn't really dug in on what the heck is our governor doing, the motion picture industry was essentially fine. That was essential, right? So we were trying to figure out, okay, well, we're making entertainment. So can we fit in that or not? And it didn't matter, because the county was like, nope, we decree that you're not. Because they were all in on the secret, which we were not, this was a favor to the people who had donated to the relevant governors, right? So for our governor, it was all about, obviously the very close relationship that he has with Hollywood and trying to keep that alive, which also relates to Pineapple Hill, and why you could have open air catering for a movie, but you couldn't have open air dining for a restaurant.
Who, by the way, spent $80,000 reportedly to comply with that mandate to be able to do
Angela
that.
Marsden. I remember I put her on my Fox show like twice. I was so I still can feel it was just so despicable that the mindset and it's people and actually sorry, I interrupted. Keep going.
That's okay. So what I was going to say is, the fear factor was like, you weren't allowed to question anything. And I think even to some degree, you're not now. You weren't allowed to question any of those rules because you were going to kill someone. Right. Like, you're okay killing someone. They're doing the best they can. And this belief that there was so much innocence and good, intention from people, combined with terrorizing the populace, really combined to have people comply. And what is remarkable to me, and I'd love your view on this, is it's still happening now. It still is people ruled by fear, number one. And then number two, you're not allowed to question anything, any of the heterodox, or you will get in trouble. So to your point of eminent domain, I'm even wondering how many lawyers are brave enough to fight these cases on behalf of all the small businesses that were murdered, which is a great term.
It's a great term.
Because it can be career ending for people to take this on. What's your take on why there's so much A, fear, and B, we've allowed so much repercussion for fighting for freedom?
Because the corporate press is evil, I think is the statement that you're looking for, right? They've been running cover the entire time for this. One of the favorite parts of my book is sort of in the beginning is the hypocrisy around masks. And regardless of, whether you think that they're helpful or not, the change in the stance was like overnight staggering. And we have quotes from major institutions basically mocking people because of people's own accord. The first thing people did was like, oh, self-protection, we'll go out and buy masks. Stop buying masks. They're harmful to you. They're terrible. I have NBC News quoted in the book mocking President Trump because at the time he had asked his healthcare advisors, that's how they're quoted. I don't know specifically who they are. We could probably guess who they are. And he was like, well, what about masks? Because, like, you know, if they didn't work, like, why would doctors wear them? And you could just kind of hear him say that, right? Like, as I'm saying that out loud. And they were basically mocking him and saying, oh, he's like focused on these small details while there's these big issues going on. And then like 3 weeks later, they do an entire 180 and, you know, go in the other direction. And like nobody is putting this together going, but you just said this like 3 weeks ago, you were mocking this. And so the fact that you have this polarization, the fact that you have the media running, you know, this interferes with messaging, this entire situation became politicized where common sense and nuance has been completely thrown out the window. So you cannot have a rational discussion on anything if people know who the directive came from. Like if we didn't know where it came from, we just put information in a box and like everything was quoted without like what party likes it or doesn't like it. Like people would objectively be able to say, oh, okay, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense. And that ability has completely been thrown out the window.
So here's the last thing I want to ask about. I think, Kristen, you have a question as well, but let me end my questions with this one, Carol, which is, you know, I want to go back to this point about the, you know, why Walmart, etc., were allowed to stay open and the local stores, and I think it's a couple of the phrases you used earlier, like too hard to control or whatever, which is like, if you put yourself in their shoes, what the people making these rules, it's kind of revealing what they think of. Small businesses, because I think even being fair to them, but correct me if I'm wrong, it would be, well, look, we have to have these policies put in place and with, you know, social distancing, and they have to clean everything, whatever, in order to keep people safe. And therefore, you know, a big company can do that because we can sort of phone the CEO and they can reassure us that they'll have these policies in place or whatever. Whereas how can we possibly expect some local store to handle things properly and do the right safety protocols? It's so patronizing and arrogant, this assumption that the little people are incapable of protecting themselves. And why wouldn't they protect themselves and their staff and their customers and their community? Do you know what I mean? It's just the whole mindset that reveals. I just love. Do you agree that that's where that was all coming from?
So I tend to always follow the money.
Oh, God. Okay.
I sort of feel like that drives everything. And so I feel like it may be more cut and dry and sort of human nature, greed oriented and control oriented. If you look at the economy and before COVID, just split it directly down the middle, about half of the economy and about half the jobs were in the hands of the small businesses, which are now 31.7 million in number. So very highly diversified across geography, industry, number, 99.9% of all business entities. So you've got, trying to deal with that. The other half of the economy is controlled by 20,000-ish big businesses.
Right.
So if you're looking for lobbying dollars, if you're looking, like you said, for someone to, add to your campaign, support your work with you on different things that you want to get passed and whatnot. And, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine. Like, what's just fundamentally easier to do? Is it easier to deal with, a handful of big businesses or this like huge independent swath of small business who, by the way, are all owned by entrepreneurs who are independent and kind of pig-headed by nature because, otherwise they wouldn't be entrepreneurs. So I think in terms of this great consolidation that I'm calling it,
great term.
Not only the economy, but of power, this unholy triumvirate of big government, big business, and big special interests, is that, if they get more of the dollars and more of the purview concentrated, then they can all control more. It's more power for the politicians, and it's more benefit for the big businesses, because we know that all the legislation that is put out ends up being anti-competitive and helping big business and hurting small business. I defy anyone to tell me great legislation that's actually helped small business. I'm still waiting to hear about some of that. And so I think that's really what they're doing. And in effect, on that spectrum that I sort of alluded to earlier, where you have capitalism on one side, that the freedom and choice and the transparency and the protection of property rights. The other side of that is central planning. It's a handful of people making decisions using force, coercion, control, usually a lot of opacity. And we are moving at an accelerated clip towards that central planning, and that sort of consolidation supports and enables that, unfortunately.
So I know, Kristen, you want to. I just want to underline that with something I said earlier on in the pandemic. I did a little piece on my Fox show, and it's all coming back to me. It's like, it was really early on when all this was happening, and as you're talking, it really reminded me of something I said then, which was what's going on now. I think I used almost the exact terminology. With this is going to be a takeover of big government, big business, big bureaucracy. I think those are the three that I used, and I related it to this book that's been very formative in my in the way I've thought about the world, which is a book that was written during the Second World War by Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. Exactly. And he wrote, and this was really the intellectual foundation of the free enterprise revolution that Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan here, all of that, right? That was really initiated by that book and subsequent writing. And he was talking about how the central planning that was engaged in order to fight and win the Second World War, putting all the factories and the government taking over the economy. And he said, look, if we're not careful, all this centralized planning that we've done in order to pursue the war effort, if we don't dismantle it, it's going to take over the economy, and then we're going to be on this the road to serfdom. That's what we're on. And it started off with this kind of idea of, we need to do this to win the war, but it's going to end in absolute tyranny and people losing their freedom. And I said, that's exactly what's going on now. And, this war against the virus and the pandemic and whatever, this is what's happening, just like in the Second World War. And we've got to be aware of it and fight it. And everything you've said has reminded me of that. Totally agree with everything you've said there. Kristen.
Yes, my question is similarly erudite, which is I want to talk about Twitter polls.
There you are. You see, that's the real stuff. That's what people really want to talk about. Exactly.
That's right.
What happened in this
the
poll?
Juicy stuff.
Tell me about this poll. I love it. What was
it? I did a bracket. I think I called it the Shameful 16. And we had people nominate this to see who were the worst governors for small business. Right. And we went through
when was this, by the way?
And we did. Oh, gosh, probably in June of 2020. Okay. So we had several. Or actually, no, you know what? I think it was in June of 2021. With the pandemic, they all start stacking up. So people have had more than a full year of goings on to be able to figure this out. And, the number one seeds were, mostly straightforward with the two favorites, Gavin Newsom from California, and at the time, then Governor Andrew Cuomo from New York, having the one seeds. And Gavin Newsom handily beats Governor Cuomo as the worst governor for small business. And this was, from everyone on Twitter voting, and this is who they selected to be your winner. So Kristen and Steve,
thank you very much.
That you're both residing in the great state of California. So congratulations.
We love awards.
Exactly.
We love it.
There you are. Listen, what a fantastic conversation, Carol. I absolutely loved talking to you. And it's reminding me how outrageous the whole thing was, and so we mustn't give up the fight. We can't just move on. So that was really timely, actually. Thank you. Where can people follow your work and get your book, and just tell us how people can keep in touch if they want to do that, which I'm sure they will.
So as I appear regularly on Fox and all different kinds of outlets and write on Fox News and Fox Business. But the best way to find out what I'm doing is I always put it on Twitter. I'm at Carol J.S. Roth on Twitter. A fair warning, you need a highly warped sense of humor to follow me. So you get the information, but you get a lot of insanity with it. So, it's just be prepared for that. And then for the book, I'm very focused on people voting with their dollars. And so would love for people to check out the book. If you enjoyed this conversation, I think you'll learn a lot. But, I'm a capitalist, so you can buy it wherever you'd like, wherever you find value, but consider buying it from your local bookstore, or bookshop.org is a great online resource where it will fulfill from a local bookstore. And they'll actually show you how much of your purchase goes back to that local small business. And they have sort of a running tally of how much, they've done to support local small businesses. And I think we need to be more intentional because, that's what capitalism is about. If we are lazy and we keep giving our money to Amazon, and then the government keeps helping them, and then the Federal Reserve keeps helping their stock price, and they have access to capital, we're all guilty. So not to say you shouldn't shop with them if you find value, but if you have opportunities to shop elsewhere, please just consider that.
Love it. Totally agree. Thank you, Carol. That was fantastic.
Thank you, guys.
I love this conversation. I'm sure if anyone in your life who is anything to do with the world of small business, I'm sure they'll enjoy it. But I think it's everyone should be interested in this. So make sure you follow us for more for this conversation and more. Obviously on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you back here soon at the next California Rebel Base.